And with no further ado, Margot Livesey.
Gosh, there are so many of you. Thank you all for coming. I'm honored to follow and precede so many wonderful readings at this podium. In his lecture, Michael Knight, I think it was 3 days ago, but it might have been 3 centuries ago, he taught, in his craft lecture, he talked eloquently about the loneliness necessary to create art. And of course, I hope most of us find this in our non-Sewanee lives. But I was thinking this morning how in our non-Sewanee lives, we experience this other kind of loneliness, the loneliness of people not understanding why a good day's work is cutting 300 lines or 300 words or 30 words. Thanks to Tennessee Williams and Wyatt Prunty, this second, less useful kind of loneliness is utterly banished at Sewanee. For 12 days, we have the luxury of being surrounded by people who totally get our lives. So huge gratitude to Tennessee and Wyatt, to Adam, Megan, Gwen, the fabulous staff, my brilliant colleagues, to all of you who live in a world of words, and extra gratitude to Randall and our opinionated, inspiring workshop. You guys rock. I'm reading from my new novel, The Boy in the Field. It's a short novel. It's set near the other Oxford in England, in a number of small towns around Oxford. And it's, I hope, coming out next summer, well before the next election. Just a pause while we all utter a silent prayer. The Boy in the Field. 1. The Field. Here is what happened one Monday in the month of September, in the last year of the last century. Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan Lang were on their way home from school. Usually they took the bus from the larger town where they attended secondary school to the smaller town where they lived. But that morning, their father had said he had an errand to run and would collect them. So they waited beside the school gates and watched the bus depart. After 15 minutes, with no sign of the familiar car, they began to walk along the road that led to their town. They each wore a version of the school uniform, a white shirt, black trousers, and a black pullover. Expecting their father to appear at any moment, they walked fast, making it a game to see how far they could get before he pulled up beside them. They left the last houses behind. Hawthorn hedges and an occasional ash tree hid the fields that bordered the road. Through one gate, they saw a herd of cows. Through another, rows of barley. The afternoon was warm and still. Only a few leaves, fringed with brown, hinted at autumn. Gnats hung in listless clouds above the tarmac. Zoe was the one who spotted something through the hedge. She had a gift for finding things, birds' nests, their mother's calculator, a missing book, a secret. "What's that?" she demanded, stooping to peer through the tangled hawthorn branches. The flash of red could have been poppies bordering the field, but the poppies had already lost their petals. Before her brothers could answer, she turned and ran back to the gate they had just passed. Matthew and Duncan watched her go. Zoe brought her knees high and pumped her arms. Last sports day, she had won the quarter mile by almost 3 seconds. As she reached the gate, Duncan, without a word, took off after her. A car sped by, the smooth engine noise undercut by a harsh rattle. Matthew looked at the sky, mostly blue, with a fortress of cumulus clouds in the east, and gave up on being the responsible one who waited for their father. The 2 bags, his and Zoe's, banged against the metal bars of the gate as he climbed over and jumped down onto the rutted field. The field had recently been harvested, and circular bales of straw lay randomly across the dull gold stubble. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent oak tree in full leaf. He caught up with first Duncan, then Zoe. From a distance, it was still possible to believe that the boy was asleep, lying on the grassy border between hedge and stubble. "Christ," whispered Zoe. The closer they got to him, the slower they walked. None of them spoke. Glinting blue bottles and smaller flies circled the boy. His hair was dark, his skin very pale. He wore a deep blue shirt, a colour Duncan would later call cobalt, black shorts, and what appeared to be long red socks. At the local private school, the younger boys wore bright red knee socks, and for the briefest moment, Zoe thought, "Oh, he's in uniform." A few steps closer, and she grasped the nature of the red. His eyelids were pale with a delicate tracery of veins. Everything that happened, they all 3 later agreed, was only possible because of those closed lids. His chest rose fractionally and fell fractionally. With no one to tell them what to feel, they did not cry out or exclaim. Zoe tiptoed forward, knelt down at a cautious distance, and leaned over to touch his bare arm where it emerged below his shirt sleeve. His skin was reassuringly warm. He was a little older than her, 18, perhaps 19. "We need to get help," she said. But she was not going anywhere. She was gently stroking his bare arm. Except for his clothes and his scarlet legs, Matthew thought, the boy could have been an illustration in a Victorian novel. The weary harvester, rest after toil, the dreaming poet. He told Duncan to go back to the road and stop a car. "Tell the driver someone's hurt," he said. "He needs an ambulance." Duncan had been staring at the boy, committing him detail by detail, colour by colour, to memory. Now, reluctantly, he acknowledged the inevitability of being the youngest. He ran back along the edge of the field, scrambled over the gate again, and stood by the side of the road. In a well-organized world, this would have been the moment for their father to appear, driving, as usual, a little too fast. The first car, black, sleek, ignored his frantic waving. So did the second. The third car, baby blue, the antenna bent at an awkward angle, slowed. Duncan stepped into the road, ready to explain. The man behind the wheel, he too was wearing a white shirt, was staring at him through the dull windscreen. And then, just as the car seemed about to stop, it accelerated, swerved around him. He glimpsed the number plate and a dent in the rear bumper and disappeared. It would have stopped for Zoe, he thought, or even for Matthew. He shouldn't have let them send him to do this, but he had, and the beautiful boy was depending on him. At the sound of another car approaching, he planted himself in the middle of the road. For a few scary seconds, the car hurtled towards him. He was about to jump aside when the driver braked. He bent down at the window. "We found a boy in the field," he pointed behind him. "He's hurt." "Hurt how?" The woman pushed up her sunglasses as if the emergency demanded naked sight. Her eyes were a colour Duncan could only call colourless. "I don't know. My brother says he needs an ambulance." "Don't move him. I'll phone 999. Leave the gate of the field open so they'll know which one." She did a U-turn in the gateway and disappeared in the direction of the town. Back in the field, his sister was still stroking the boy's arm, his brother kneeling on the other side of him, fanning away the flies with a blue school notebook. They did not speak as he approached. He sensed they had not spoken during his absence. "A woman's gone for help," he said, and knelt beside Zoe. His shirt had pulled loose as he ran, and the hem grazed the grass. "What's the matter with him? Did he fall?" "Maybe," Zoe said. While Duncan was summoning help, she had noticed that the boy's shorts were torn in several places. 2 holes in one leg, one near the waist, one in the other leg. Last autumn, her mother had lectured her and her friend Moira about how now that they were 15, they had to be careful. "Don't walk around alone at night," she had said. "Don't accept lifts from strangers. If a grown-up starts behaving oddly, walk away." "Oddly how?" Zoe had asked. "Making remarks about your appearance, touching you." Her mother waved her hand. "Making you feel weird." Alone, she and Moira had giggled away the warning, but now her mother's words came back. She tried not to think about the torn fabric, what had made the holes, what lay beneath. From beyond the hedge came the sounds of a car approaching, disappearing, then another. "Do we know him?" she asked. "I don't," Matthew said. As he moved the notebook, the flies retreated with almost military precision, and with the same precision returned. Everything was warm and frightening. The boy was alive, which meant he might die. He was not sure Zoe and Duncan understood that. "Maybe he looks different," Zoe persisted. "Maybe we've seen him at the shops or on the bus." Matthew was still shaking his head. That the boy's life might have touched theirs only made the idea of his death more frightening when Duncan spoke. If Zoe was the one who found things, their little brother was the one who noticed them. The different yellows of 2 egg yolks, the way a person's lips twitched when they met him, the first snowdrops pushing up through the frosty grass, the curve of a dog's eyebrows. Matthew had asked Zoe once if she thought Duncan was better at noticing things because he was adopted. "No," she had said, "because he's Duncan." Now Duncan said, "I've seen him before, but I'm not sure where." Looking at the boy, Duncan too thought of a picture, a painting his art teacher had shown him of a wide-eyed, cream-coloured bull climbing into the sky with a girl on his back. Zeus had courted Europa by breathing out a saffron crocus from his dark nostrils. Who could resist a flower born of such sweetness? Not Europa. She had clambered onto the bull's back, thinking to ride him around the meadow, garland him with flowers, only to find the bull carrying her skywards towards unknown terror or unknown bliss. Had something like that happened to the boy? "If his eyes were open," Zoe said, "I bet you'd remember." If his eyes were open, Matthew thought, we would not be kneeling here. He would be in pain, and we couldn't bear it. How long had they been here? 10 minutes? 20? The swallows were flying low, almost grazing the stubble. Last summer, he had found a swallow lying, stunned, on the paving stones beneath the kitchen window. He had placed it on a little pillow of grass on the garden table, hoping it would revive. The next morning, the bird was gone, the grass mixed with feathers. As he edged closer to the boy, still fanning him, he felt something soft beneath his left knee, a spiraling strip, maybe 8 inches long, of brownish apple peel. He tossed it in the direction of the oak tree. "You're going to be all right," Zoe said. The boy gave a small sigh. His lips moved. The sigh became a word. Each of them caught it. No more words followed. As they knelt quietly, the swallows drew closer. Briefly, Duncan imagined the scene as if he were riding on the back of one of the birds, looking down at the boy lying in the grass, his blue shirt and black shorts and red legs ending in black trainers, slightly dusty, pointing skywards, and the 3 of them in their white shirts kneeling beside him, keeping vigil. When he descended again, it was with a longing to memorize every detail of the boy. He had seldom had license to examine another person so closely. Years later, he would remember him more vividly than men and women he had loved, friends he had adored. His hair was shoulder-length, wavy, the brown of soil after rain. His forehead was high, his nose straight with an almost invisible bump at the bridge. His nostrils, against his pale skin, were faintly pink. His lips were parted, the upper a little fuller. His ears, shell-like, lay close to his head. The left had a tiny dark hole in the lobe. A thin silver chain lay across the hollow between his collarbones. He wore a watch, the black leather strap faded and cracked. His hands were open, palms up, his fingers gently curved. Duncan was still itemizing the boy when there was a commotion in the road, the sounds of a vehicle stopping, doors opening, voices, and then 3 men hurrying down the edge of the field, one carrying a stretcher. No one had mentioned the children, and no provision had been made for them. One of the paramedics called, "All right there?" over his shoulder as they hurried towards the gate with their burden. "Fine," Matthew called back. By the time the 3 of them reached the gate, the ambulance was gone. They half walked, half ran the rest of the way home. Something enormous had happened. They hurried past the sign for their town, the primary school they had each attended, the church, the pub, and the corner shop, past the houses of their neighbors, past the blousy yellow and white roses in their front garden, and through their blue front door. As it closed behind them, their father, Hal, stepped out of the kitchen, an apron around his waist, a dish towel dangling from one hand. He was a blacksmith, or, as he sometimes joked, an artisanal metal worker, and usually got home earlier than their mother to make supper. "Where on earth did you get to?" he said. "I waited at the school. Then the caretaker told me you were walking home, but I didn't see you on the road. Did you get a lift?" He sounded more amused than annoyed, but as Zoe and Matthew took turns recounting what had happened, his jaw tightened. "Wait a minute," he interrupted. "This boy, he'd been taken ill? He'd had an accident?" Zoe described the holes in the boy's shorts, the blood on his legs. I think someone stabbed him, Matthew offered. Stabbed him, Duncan said. It hadn't occurred to him to wonder how the boy came to be lying there. But of course, Matthew was right. Someone had made the blood spill down his legs. Did anyone phone the police? Their father was looking at each of them in turn, as if collectively they might be to blame. Duncan said he hadn't mentioned the police to the woman in the car. Was I meant to? Still holding the dish towel, their father said he thought he'd give the police station in Oxford a call, and stepped over to the phone. At supper, the five of them sitting around their round table, their mother, Betsy, made them tell the story again. Thank goodness you found him, she said. Who knows what might have happened? He'd have died, said Zoe severely. We have 5 or 6 quarts of blood in our bodies. If we lose 5 or 6 pints, we die. She glared at her plate, the meek fish pie and green beans. Then, turning to her brothers, she said, Do you think the person who attacked him was still there? Do you think he saw us? Separately and together, each of them considered, was someone lurking behind one of the bales, peering down through the low leaves of the oak tree? Someone could have hidden behind a bale, Duncan said, but I don't think they did. The field had felt the way their house did after Arthur, the dachshund, died, empty. You said he'd been there for a while, said their mother, looking as if she might write down their answers. She was a solicitor who dealt mostly with family law. It was true, Matthew thought. The boy looked as if he'd been lying there for hours, but none of them had said so. Their mother, like the witnesses she so often complained about, was making assumptions. But why would someone want to hurt him? He demanded. Their parents exchanged glances. Maybe he got in an argument, their mother suggested. Maybe he stole something. Her eyebrows rose towards her reddish-brown hair. People often thought she dyed it. Duncan put down his fork. No one with such shell-like ears could be a thief. Or maybe their father, too, was imagining the scene. It was about sex. He was the parent they could count on, not to worry that they were too young to hear certain things. The X of sex tinkled against the salt and pepper shakers. At the school Christmas party last year, Matthew had kissed Rachel in the cloakroom for 45 minutes. He had had other girlfriends, 3 of them, but they had in no way prepared him for the astonishing discovery that bodies, his own, another person's, could be the source of such pleasure. What your father means, their mother said, is that there are people who are wired differently, who get a thrill out of doing bad things, but they're very few and far between. She was still wearing the suit she often wore in court. Duncan claimed it was the colour of old potatoes. We're not children, Zoe speared a green bean. We know about perverts. Some person, some man, dragged the boy into a field or got him to follow him, and then he stabbed him. That person could be living in our street. He could be walking past our home right now. On the word now, the doorbell rang. Each of them startled. Their father half rose, looked around the table, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and went to answer. Few people passing Hal in the street would have guessed his strength. He was 5'11", square-shouldered and tightly muscled. But Matthew had seen him move a piano across a room, bend iron bars into shape. Don't, their mother started to say, and stopped. They were not going to become a family who didn't answer their door. On the doorstep stood a man whose pale shirt, dark jacket, and dark trousers were as much a uniform as that worn by the policewoman standing behind him. He introduced himself as Detective Hugh Price and apologized for the timing of his visit. "I understand, Mr. Lang, that your children found a young man wounded in a field." Hal showed them into the room they jokingly called the parlor. He and Betsy had furnished it as a dining room and then ended up, even when they had guests, eating in the kitchen. A stack of boxes stood in one corner and the table was piled with bills. Next to the computer, taking up almost as much space, was a model of the set Zoe had made last spring when she was the stage manager for Antony and Cleopatra. Against one wall stood the upright piano on which only Duncan still took lessons. From the top, Matthew's fencing mask blindly observed the room. Hal moved the bills and pulled out 2 chairs. Back in the kitchen, he dispatched Matthew to answer the detective's questions. During the long summers when he was becoming a teenager, Matthew had read scores of detective novels. Along with many TV programs, they had given him an image of this tribe of men who drank too much, shaved too little, were oddly erudite, seldom happily married, and in general behaved more like the villains they were trying to catch than the citizens they were trying to protect. Often they had some arcane hobby, growing roses, listening to opera. At first sight, Hugh Price contradicted most of these notions. He wore a wedding ring, and even at 8 in the evening, his fair skin was smoothly shaved. His triangular face, like a Siamese cat's, Duncan said later, balanced neatly on a long, elegant neck. He offered Matthew his hand and introduced himself and Police Constable Hannah Jones. Beneath her hat, her hair was wavy and her eyebrows swooped like wings. She was, Matthew guessed, only a few years older than him. As he gave his full name and age, he felt his palms grow slippery. "I'm not guilty," he thought indignantly, but his body had its own ideas. "How is he?" he said. The detective said the boy had recovered consciousness. The doctors expect him to be fine in a few weeks. "Can you tell me in your own words what happened this afternoon?" Briefly, Matthew pictured other people's words hanging in the air, laundry on a washing line. He could borrow one person's pajamas, another's T-shirt. He explained about their father not showing up at the school, how they had started to walk home. The detective paused in his rearranging of the miniature columns in Zoe's set. "You don't usually walk?" "No, it's nearly 5 miles. We take the bus. Sometimes we cycle." "Did you see anything lying by the side of the road? Pass any cars or cyclists? Other people walking?" A number of cars had passed. One cyclist that Matthew recalled, a man in sleek shorts pedaling hard, but no other pedestrians. They'd been discussing what to give their mother for her birthday. Zoe wanted to get her a necklace. Duncan had seen a print he liked in an antique shop. The afternoon had been entirely ordinary until Zoe spotted something through the hedge, and he and Duncan followed her into the field. "Was the gate open? Was there any marks on it? Anything unusual?" Matthew yearned to be helpful, but all he remembered was the surprising newness of the gate. "No," he said. He described the empty field, the boy lying on the edge of the stubble. Last September, he and his friend Benjamin had carried a ladder out to the field at the back of Benjamin's house, climbed up onto a bale and shared a beer. It had been oddly satisfying, sitting on the prickly straw, looking out over the field as the dusk gathered and the bats flitted overhead. A fox had trotted past, something dark in its mouth, never thinking to look up. "And did you recognize the boy?" the detective said. "Duncan, my brother, thought he'd seen him before, but he couldn't remember where. Do you know who he is?" "His name is Carol Lustig. He works nights at the cottage hospital." The detective let the name occupy the room before he asked his next question. "When you saw him, did anything strike you?" "We thought he was asleep." But no, that wasn't right. He knew, various people had told him, that he tossed restlessly in his sleep and Zoe thrashed around. The boy had lain so still. The detective remarked his hesitation, and he admitted that what the boy really reminded him of was a statue at Dorchester Abbey, John de Stoner lying on his tomb, his marble clothing neatly arranged for eternity. Sitting next to the detective, the constable made a note. Had he finally said something of interest, or had she just remembered that she needed to buy eggs? "Did you touch him?" Matthew shook his head. He had wanted to. Zoe did. "And did he speak?" "Once. He said coward." Through the open window, a sudden breeze caught the overhead light. Their three shadows swayed back and forth across the piano. Matthew imagined their house, all the houses in the street, in the town, empty of people, like the ruined mansion they had come across in Wales last summer, the rooms decorated with flowery wallpaper, ivy creeping through the window. When their shadows quieted, the detective said, "So, were there any signs besides his injuries that another person had been there, that there'd been a fight?" Matthew recalled the boy's hands lying on the grass, empty. He himself often went out with only the contents of his pockets, but when he was going to school or to his job at the co-op, he always had a backpack. He didn't have anything with him, he said. Maybe that was a sign of another person. The detective was nodding. According to a nurse at the cottage hospital, Carol had been carrying a backpack when he left work at 7 a.m. and discovered that his bicycle had a flat tire. Whoever picked him up was probably the same person who attacked him and took his bag. We'll know more when he's conscious. Matthew heard the probably. "Are you saying someone found him before us, stole his bag and left him there?" In books and films, the answer nearly always turned out to be not the obvious answer. "No, but it's important not to take anything for granted." "Do you fence?" The detective nodded towards the mask on top of the piano. "I'm taking lessons." "Épée or foil?" "Foil so far." "If you remember anything else, no matter how small, please get in touch. Don't worry about bothering me or seeming stupid." He held out a business card, the first Matthew had ever been offered. Then, tilting his triangular face, the detective said, "You did a good thing today. You saved a boy's life." While Matthew talked to the detective, his father, back at the kitchen table, helped himself to more fish pie. It had turned out well, and described his latest commission, a wrought iron garden gate. He had persuaded the customer to let him use William Morris's willow pattern. "Nice," said Duncan, "lots of little leaves." Shut up, Zoe thought. Why was the detective taking so long? What could Matthew possibly have to say? Her impatience shredded the air. She pulled the elastic band off her ponytail, shook out her hair. When Duncan stood to clear the plates, she stayed in her chair. She could do nothing but wait. Matthew returned. As she at last stepped into the parlor, she felt her shoulders relax, her heart beat slow. This man would explain what had happened. He would make sense of the boy's scarlet legs. The detective introduced himself and asked her full name and age. While the policewoman wrote down her answers, he absent-mindedly plucked Cleopatra's barge from the blue ribbon of the Nile that ran across the back of the set behind the forum. "Could you tell me about this afternoon?" he said. She gave her account, trying to be as precise as possible, and asked if the boy was all right. The detective nodded. "According to the doctors, he's going to be. His name is Carol Lustig. He works as an orderly at the cottage hospital. Hopefully he'll be able to give a description of his assailant tomorrow." "But why would anyone hurt him?" Zoe said. "Are there really people who drive around at 7 a.m. waiting to stab hospital orderlies?" The detective cradled Cleopatra's barge in his long fingers. The detective cradled Cleopatra's barge. In his long fingers, it looked like a large canoe. "Perhaps they had an argument? Your brother said you touched him." Was he accusing her? She couldn't tell. "I wanted him to know he wasn't alone. I didn't hurt him." "I'm sure he appreciated that. Did he say anything while you were with him?" "He said, 'cowrie,' like the little shells the Vikings used as money. She had an egg cup on her desk, half full of the ones she'd found on the beach in Wales." "Cowrie, you're sure?" Zoe said she was. Maybe he was dreaming. Both the detective and the police constable wrote in their notebooks. "Please phone," he said, "if you remember anything else." She slipped his card into her pocket. "Do you mind putting my barge back?" she said. That night, Duncan turned off the lights in his room and stood at the window, staring down into the shadowy garden. Their house was in the middle of a terrace, the garden separated from those of their neighbours by brick walls. Beyond the lawn and the picnic table was a pergola covered with roses and honeysuckle, and beyond that a bed of rhododendrons, azaleas, smoke plants, and 2 laburnum trees. The breeze that had sprung up earlier had grown stronger, and the trees and shrubs were swaying. The boy's one word, cowslip, had made him think of the little mermaid and her sisters tending their gardens beneath the turquoise sea. When he was younger, 8 or 9, he'd read the story over and over, picturing the garden filled with cornflowers and cowslips, willing the prince to recognize the little mermaid. Now, as he stood watching, a person stepped forward beneath the laburnum trees. "My first mother," he thought. For years, he'd seldom spoken of his birth mother, rarely thought of her, but not for a moment did he doubt his vision. Even as he pressed his face to the glass, the dark form faded, thinned, became another shadow among shadows. Everyone else was in bed. Walking as quietly as possible, he went downstairs and made his way from room to room. He had always liked windows, the eyes of a house, giving and receiving light. But now, as he checked each lock, they seemed stupidly fragile. One stone and anyone could climb in. Once again, he missed Arthur, who had announced each visitor with a single low bark. Back in his room, he wedged a chair under the doorknob like people did in films. Still, he did not turn on the light, which would betray his presence, or the radio. Lying in bed, he felt guilt creeping up his arms. He was leaving his parents and siblings undefended. Worse than that, he was hoping that any intruder would be waylaid by more tempting choices. When the guilt reached his shoulders, he got out of bed and moved the chair back to his desk. Thank you.